On this prequel episode, we've got our fan poll follow-ups for If Beale Street Could Talk. We're learning things about monster boyfriends and previewing the Twilight Saga New Moon. Hello and welcome back to This Film is Lit, podcast where we talk about movies that are based on books. We took a week to go down into a sad, depressing, but important place with If Beale Street Could Talk. We're going to talk a little bit about that more here in a second with our fan poll follow-up. But we're going to get back into the Twilight Saga, 200 pages in, and it's the same book.
It certainly has the same pacing issues.
It's the same book. This is my hot take. It's not a hot take. I'm sure it's been said a million times. But this is the same book as the first one, except Jacob is Bella and Bella is Edward. Boy, just sitting here and was like, I think we already talked about this. Did we make this joke in the Twilight episode? I think we maybe did, but just recut. We did this about something. Made this joke about something. Recut When Will My Life Begin from Tangled, and but it's now When Will the Plot Begin? And that's just for this. That's just this. I sing that for every Twilight book so far that I've read of the first two. When will the plot begin? Because there's no plot. I mean, there is stuff happening, but anyways, we'll get to that much later. First, we've got, as we always do, our patron shoutouts. No new patrons this week, but we do have our Academy Award winners, and they are Eli Youngs, Gratch, Just Gratch, Shelby Says Black Lives and Trans Lives Matter, Mr. Nobody, Cancel MLB 2020, Disagree. They're not playing in front of crowds, are they? I
do not know.
They're playing a shortened season.
Thing that I don't know if
they're doing a shortened
about.
Season, and they're doing 60 games, and they're testing all the players. And I thought they weren't playing in front of crowds, but maybe they are. If they're playing in front of crowds, that's stupid. But I thought they were just doing it on TV. I could be wrong. I mean, so maybe I don't know. If they're doing it in front of crowds, I could maybe sign off on that. But because I believe Korea and stuff or Japan was doing it without crowds, and it was working just fine. I remember another podcast I listened to. They talked about opening arguments, which at least one of these patrons came from that. They discussed how like Japan or Korea was, because they're baseball fans, were discussing how they were doing it, and they were doing it without crowds and stuff, and it seemed to be working fine. So, but I don't know enough of the details. I haven't been following it super closely. I know they're not having any crowds for like these spring training games they're playing, and I thought that whatever. Maybe they have other reasons for canceling MLB 2020. Maybe something else happened. I don't know. And finally, Alina Doletkolova, thank you all very much. Cancel MLB 2020. I'm going to need the deets on that. Hit us up on the social media somewhere and explain why you want to cancel MLB 2020. Or unless you mean the game.
Is it like...
No,
is
that's
it
the show.
A COVID kind of a cancel, or is it like a Twitter kind of a cancel?
Yeah, is it like literally cancel? My guess is they mean literally cancel the season instead of like doing this weird half roll. Maybe they're just upset that it's like a weird half season. I don't know. I'd be really interested to hear your reasoning, because I haven't done enough research to know like what all the details are. I'm just excited to watch baseball again if it comes back. But obviously I would only be excited if they're going to do it in a way that's safe and makes sense. But from my understanding, I thought they were, but that may be wrong. So explain yourself. All right, that was it for our patrons. Thank you, everybody who is an Academy Award-winning patron. If you want to count yourself among that prestigious number, you can go to patreon.com/thisfilmislit. Support us for $15 a month. You get a shout out every prequel episode, and you also get priority recommendations, which we've done quite a few of them already from our humble Academy Award winners. If you're support us at the $15 a month level, you recommend a film/book, it jumps towards the top of our queue. And you're much more likely to get it done quickly.
As close as we can get it.
As close as we can get it.
The queue.
Because we get a fair amount of recommendations just in general. And we have a huge list that we've put together of stuff we're interested in. And we try to diversify what we're doing, so we're not all doing just like a bunch of fantasy books or whatever. So yeah, that's the perk you get for being an Academy Award-winning patron. Let's go ahead now and do our fan poll follow-up for If Beale Street Could Talk.
Yeah, well, that's just like your opinion, man.
We didn't have a lot of engagement
Very low
with
engagement
this
week. It wasn't a super popular movie, but little disappointed.
Yeah.
Because it's a fantastic movie, as we discussed.
More people should see it.
More people should definitely see it.
But we did have 4 votes on Twitter. 3 of them were for the movie. 1 was for the book. We didn't have anybody come out to defend
one
or the other.
Yeah.
We did have a comment from at April Idmansky, who's been on our show before and who also co-hosts No Such Thing as a Bad Movie podcast. And April said, just here to recommend Moonlight.
Yeah.
Very similar score and same gorgeous cinematography, but more of a neon color palette.
Yeah, from what I've seen of the film, like the trailer and the posters, it's like purples and blues and like neon. And it looks similarly gorgeous, and I've heard it's great. So we're gonna watch it at some point. It's on our Hulu list because it is on Hulu as well, I believe. It's on our list. We're gonna watch it. So we still haven't gotten to freaking Parasite, and I'm super mad about it. So we'll get there eventually.
And we had no engagement on Facebook or Instagram, so
there you go.
That was our
nobody interested
follow-up.
Wow, you're all canceled. This is a very important film. Jeez. All right, let's move on. We're gonna learn some things. We got a nice, long, meaty learning things segment this week. Katie, you put some work into this one. We're learning about the monster boyfriend trope.
No matter what anybody tells you, words and ideas can change the world.
I'm going to sit back, just kind of hang out and listen, learn along with everybody else.
So this week, we're learning about a specific trope that's probably a lot older than you might initially think it is. Now, we're calling it the monster boyfriend trope, since that's how we referred to it when it came up during our Twilight episode.
That's how I referred to it. I don't know if that's even the right name for it.
TV Tropes refers to it as the much more gender-neutral "you sexy beast."
Fair enough.
But I don't think that monster boyfriend is necessarily incorrect, because as I'll discuss later in the segment, it does tend to be geared towards
the monster tends to be male.
The monster tends to be male, geared towards women who are into men. We'll talk more about it later. But to sum up this trope, it's essentially when mythical creatures that traditionally would be feared or shunned within a narrative become the object of romantic/sexual desire. Now, usually when we see this, negative characteristics of these creatures get downplayed, positive characteristics get emphasized, but they will generally retain the definitive characteristic that makes them dangerous or that makes them that creature. So, for example, the Twilight series downplays the fact that vampires drink human blood by making Edward a vegetarian vampire, while simultaneously retaining that definitive vampire characteristic by having him crave Bella's blood like more than anything else.
Yeah, they basically find a way to make the story possible.
Yeah.
By not just having the boyfriend eat, or, the monster eat the person.
Yeah.
By subduing their normal human killing trait or whatever their thing is. Yeah.
Yeah. It's still present, but we kind of find a way to downplay it within the story. So to understand where this trope comes from, we need to go way back into folklore and take a look at the folklore type of the animal bridegroom. So the animal bridegroom stories appear in cultures all over the world. It's one of the more common folklore types, right up there with Cinderella. And animal bridegroom stories feature maidens who are married off to animals, sometimes in recognizable forms, and sometimes they're more of like beasts/monsters, like conglomerate animals. This is usually unwilling on her part initially. She might have been captured or maybe forced into the arrangement due to a male family member losing a bargain or paying off a debt of some kind. But as the story progresses, she usually comes to love the animal bridegroom. Maybe they turn out to be compatible, or perhaps she has an influence that tames him or even breaks a curse and restores him to human form. Now, the obvious example here that everybody's going to recognize is Beauty and the Beast.
Yeah.
But there are many, many versions of this story. Now, it's a pretty commonly accepted theory that animal bridegroom stories developed among women as a coping mechanism for dealing with arranged or otherwise unwanted marriages. Like, hey, it sucks that you have to marry this beast, but look at the bright side. Maybe he'll turn out to be a prince.
Yeah.
But how does that relate to modern stories? After all, arranged marriage isn't really the common thing that it used to be, at least not in the Western world, but we won't get into that right now. And an eternally cursed vampire isn't really quite the same as a beast who turns back into a human at the end of the story. As a side note, on the flip side to that, it's also a pretty common response for girls to be disappointed by the beast's human form. So what's going on here? Okay. Now, to go off of that, like I mentioned earlier, this trope does seem to be aimed almost exclusively at women who are into men. Not that monster girlfriends don't exist, but they tend to be less on the monstrous side, more humanoid, still pretty, maybe even sexy.
Yeah. I mean, and this isn't the trope, but if you look at any character, if you go to any RPG video game and look at the character creator for the male and female versions of, like, say, orcs or elves or whatever, generally speaking, the male version look much more monstrous
yeah.
for lack of a better word, and the female versions tend to, and this is a good example of this is which I believe is a little complicated because I think she's half orc, but in the Warcraft movie, one of the main characters is a female orc, and she's like just green but like super sexy still.
Yeah.
And most of the orcs are like these big, like, hulking, giant. Now, I think that one's a little complicated because if I remember correctly, she's like half human or something like that. But yeah, that's a common thing across media, regardless of even outside of this specific trope.
Yeah.
That just tends to be, pretty
Yeah,
common.
so like I said earlier, the monster boyfriend moniker isn't really far off base. It's not exactly like gender inclusive.
Yeah.
But these stories do tend to be, geared towards women who are into men.
And when speaking of a trope, it is potentially less problematic because you're commenting on the fact that this trope is problematic. It gendered in that way. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
calling it the monster boyfriend trope while not being gender neutral maybe isn't, I could be convinced otherwise, but to me, strikes me as not like necessarily, it's like calling it like, if you're naming the trope and describing this trope as a potentially problematic thing, the fact that the name of the trope isn't gender neutral to me doesn't strike me as like as problematic in and of itself.
No, you're
But
right. I mean, it's really just describing what the trope is.
Yeah.
And that is what it is.
Right. And now obviously there are other examples of it, of swapped, different versions,
Yeah.
but in general, yeah.
So, what's going on here? Why do these stories exist? Why are women into it? Is it because it's taboo? Is it because regular human men just can't measure up? Is it an extreme version of yet another trope that all girls want bad boys?
Secret answer, D, all of the above.
I think the answer is yes, but also no to all of those things. I think it's yes because it is taboo and it is dangerous. And for a lot of people, there's a certain kind of sexiness to that. And if you don't believe me, hop on over to Amazon and look up monster erotica.
Yes.
And I think it's also yes because monster boyfriends are, at least some of them are, essentially a heightened, intensified version of traditional masculinity. They're overprotective, Maybe they're even brutish, they're huge, they're hairy, etc., etc. It's testosterone on steroids in a way.
Yeah.
And again, for a lot of people, there's a sexual appeal to that kind of thing. And let's be real, women are often told that they should be ashamed of their sexuality. So removing a fantasy, a sexual fantasy from reality, let's say by having the heroine bang a werewolf instead of a regular dude who happens to be hairy and domineering, that's a way to cope with that shame.
Yeah.
And let's not forget, too, that it's not just about sex. The heroine in these stories can see what's beyond that brutish exterior and access the heart of gold that's on the inside. Maybe she can bring out the good that was always there, or maybe she can change him for the better, but she's almost always the only one who can do so. And a lot of people would call that toxic, and I'm not going to disagree. It's a bit hung up on ideas about women as a, quote, civilizing force that can beat back a man's animalistic nature, and there's a lot that's problematic about that.
Yeah, and on top of just the reinforcement of traditional gender roles and the concept of gender in general, and it's, there's a lot of messiness tied up in it, but yeah.
But at their core, many of these stories are also about trust and exchange of power. The monster boyfriend might be a literal monster, but at the end of the day, it's the human woman who calls the shots. She is the center of the monster boyfriend's world, the only one with the power to tame the beast, and even though he might be a brute, the monster boyfriend would never willingly harm her in any way. And that is a narrative coping mechanism as real as anything.
Indeed. That's the monster boyfriend. Well, sorry. That's the, what did you call it?
Monster boyfriend.
Well, yes, but you
sexy beast.
You sexy beast trope. I was going to go with the gender neutral term. Might as well. That is the you sexy beast trope. Now, you are a little more learned, as am I. That was a fun little primer. I prefer primer.
You prefer primer to primer? I prefer
primer to primer. Primer is paint. To me, I think that's what it is. Like, primer is paint. Primer is the thing where you're learning something. In my head. I know that's not like the actual distinction, but for me. Anyways, that's not important. Let's move on and do some book facts for New Moon.
I love you.
You're my only reason to stay alive, if that's what I am.
It's time. Happy birthday, Bella. Let's open your presents. There's a cake, too.
Alice, that cake could feed 50. You guys don't even eat.
Thanks. Oh, paper cut.
What happened with Jasper was nothing.
Nothing compared to what could have happened. I promise never to put you through anything like this ever again. This is the last time you'll ever see me.
The Twilight Saga, New Moon. Is a 2006 romantic fantasy novel by author Stephanie Meyer. It is the second novel in the Twilight series. We're chugging along towards the halfway point in this series.
4 books.
And I mentioned in the Twilight prequel, I believe was where I talked about this, that when Meyer finished writing Twilight, she found herself writing multiple 100-page epilogues to the story, and has been quoted as saying, "I quickly realized I wasn't ready to stop writing about Bella and Edward. Who would be?" So she began writing a sequel, which was titled Forever Dawn. But while she was working on it, she learned that Twilight was going to be published as a young adult novel. Now, one problem with Forever Dawn as a sequel, though, was that it was not a young adult novel. It time jumped a few years, skipping Bella's last year of high school, and it apparently also had more mature themes. We're going to learn a little bit more about Forever Dawn in our Breaking Dawn prequel. But I did want to mention it here because that was like the first sequel that she wrote to Twilight. It was like a time jump like more mature novel.
Did it turn? And I mean, we don't want to spoil a lot of stuff, but did it essentially morph into Breaking Dawn?
She said that she used some of what happened in it as a basis for Breaking Dawn.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which I can't wait for us to get to Breaking Dawn. Like, you're gonna love it. It's a trip.
As long as things happen, I'm on board.
Well, things do happen.
Okay, thank God.
Now, obviously, the next book after Twilight needed to be young adult.
Yeah.
Since that's what Twilight was being published as. So Stephanie Meyer started on a new sequel that took place during Bella's senior year of high school. She started outlining the book and thinking of what her characters would do, and claims that she, quote, swiftly regretted asking them for the story. She says she didn't like the idea of Edward leaving and tried to think of other plot options, but in the end, she said she accepted the inevitability of it.
I'm a little confused by what the quote swiftly regretted asking them for the story. Who is them in this instance?
Them
is it the characters?
characters.
Okay.
Yes.
That's what I thought, but I just wanted to clarify and make sure there wasn't like.
So a lot of writers approach their stories like that,
right?
By like quote asking the characters.
Yeah.
I tend to be more plot driven as a writer, so like. No offense to anyone who does this. I always find that like a little bit hokey sounding. That like, oh, I just asked the characters.
Well, that's like
George
R.R. Martin's big thing, right?
Yeah,
like that's his
character
big, like, gardening
driven
fucking thing. He talks about like growing a garden and like
kind of
or whatever. It's like character driven
Yeah.
versus, and he's like the plot grows from the whatever. Okay, I just wanted to make sure it wasn't like she had asked like the online forums or something. Like that's who the
that would
was.
be even better, actually. Yeah. No, she asked the characters.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah.
And apparently the characters told her that Edward just had to leave. She's also said that she found it difficult to write Bella's pain over Edward's departure and often cried while writing those parts. But apparently she had never suffered a heartbreak like Bella's, apparently never had her heart broken, so she couldn't draw inspiration from personal experience, but supposedly based it on how she thought she would feel if she lost a child, which is not weird at all.
But not because she had lost a child.
Right.
Just how she thought she might feel if she lost a child. But she couldn't put her place in the mindset of how she thought she might feel if her boyfriend left.
I feel
That's such a weird...
Yeah. Like I feel like you should maybe imagine like, oh, how would I feel if my husband left me?
Yeah.
Or like, I don't know. It's a little bit odd.
It's a strange choice because again, it's not like if you had said like, oh, but she based it on how she felt when her mother died or something, like the loss she felt when her mother died. Okay, like you're pulling from some real thing, but she's pulling from an imagined scenario. That's just different than the imagined scenario
not
that
the
she's
imagined
writing.
scenario. Yeah, I'm not really sure what she's got going on, as we've covered before. So the title New Moon was chosen to reflect the mood of the sequel, and also to follow up with the Twilight kind of celestial sky theme.
Sky theme.
Yeah. As this is the blackest period in Bella's life, Meyer felt it was appropriate to name the book after the darkest kind of night, a night with no moon, hence New Moon.
Are we still using blackest to describe bad things? I feel like maybe we shouldn't.
I don't want to use darkest twice.
I feel like darkest is better. Oh, did you use darkest somewhere else?
Yeah.
The most absolute time of night.
Absolute, yeah.
Whatever. I was just being
moonless. No moon. Anyway, Meyer wrote New Moon in 5 months. She has said that she found the editing process much longer and more difficult than the same process with Twilight. Also, unlike Twilight, which Meyer had intended not to publish at first, which we discussed, she this time knew that New Moon was going to be published and had what she described as a horrible feeling much like stage fright while she was writing it, which I think is understandable. I think there's a freeness to just like writing something for yourself.
Oh yeah.
that you can't get when you like know that
Yeah.
it's going to be
Yeah, writing
published
the
and
sequel's
read
gotta
by
be a
billions of
It's
people.
got to be a nightmare. Like writing the first one, yeah, whatever.
Yeah.
What is what it is. Second one, oh boy, yeah.
And like knowing too how strong of feelings people have about the story.
Yeah.
That must have been awful. I don't envy her that.
No.
The first draft of New Moon apparently differed significantly from the manuscript published. Originally, Bella was not going to find out that Jacob was a werewolf, so as a result, we were going to lose about 70 pages following Bella's discovery of Jacob's true nature. Darn.
Well, I'm not there yet. I can't wait for that. That'll be at least be something going on other than motorcycle repair.
Meyer has also stated that while many thought she planned for Jacob to be a werewolf from the very beginning, that was actually not the case. Twilight was originally going to be a standalone novel, so she hadn't planned further than that, which is totally not obvious at all as you continue to read the series. But while the Quileute legend about the tribe being descended from wolves is real, Meyer added the bit about the Cold Ones and them having like a centuries-old beef with vampires, and that apparently happened to work out in her favor. And speaking of things that just happened to work out in her favor, I'm going to put a big allegedly in front of this one because this is all according to Stephanie Meyer.
Okay.
So when she was coming up with the location in Italy to be the home place of the antagonistic Volturi, she originally didn't want to use a real city, much like she did with like Forks, but instead wanted to make up an imaginary city. She wanted to place an imaginary city called Volturin in Tuscany. However, upon consulting a map, she discovered that there was already a city called Volterra in the area. So she went with Volterra and called it, quote, a pretty creepy coincidence.
I can buy that in the sense that she probably did research and titled and named the Volturi based on some sort of Italian something. Mm-hmm. I don't know what, but she probably did. Like she probably looked up something and came across and then so went with the Volturi and then came up with a riff on that name. And because she based Volturi on something Italian, the fact that there's a city called Volterra is not like that odd of a coincidence. You know what I mean?
I also just really like, though, I like the idea that she's like the anti-J.K. Rowling, where like it wasn't planned from the beginning, but it just like keeps working out for some reason.
Yeah.
The names don't actually mean anything, but it just keeps working out in her favor.
The names are that's true. None of the characters are named like vampire in another language.
That's true. Yeah.
Oh god.
I mean, she did give them like, for the most part, period appropriate names, so there's that, I guess. Yeah. So.
And do we know if she's a giant transphobe? Probably.
I mean, probably.
Probably. Odds are high.
But at least she's not tweeting about it.
Ay.
Supposedly, when advance reading copies of the book began to go out, Meyer would ask people to read New Moon all the way through twice. I'm going to read you this quote from her website. She said, "I've found that readers are so anxious about the absence of Edward that they can't settle into the middle portion of the book. They skim and speed read and flip ahead until, at last, they find him again. However, at that point, they've missed the main section of the novel almost completely. On a second reading, knowing that Edward will return to the story at the proper place and time, the reader can slow down." What's your take on that?
I mean, I'm not speed reading. I mean, part of that's because we're doing it for the show, not just for, like, because I want to. I could see if I was super into it, and even then I wouldn't. I would... I mean, I get what she's saying. That like if this character is super important to you and you're like, when's this character come? Like it would definitely cause a distraction. Mm-hmm. could understand what she's saying, and so I definitely could see there's a time because there is something to be said. You know, we talked about this before in terms of like movies and stuff that sometimes on a second watch, I mean, not sometimes, every time on a second watching, you see stuff you missed the first time.
Yeah, and
even in some regards, sometimes it's if you know the outcome, or like if you've heard about something is going to happen, like a certain episode of Game of Thrones where you know something happens at the end, maybe you don't. You're so like anxious for that moment to happen. Mm-hmm. I'm just choosing Game of Thrones because it's the first thing that jumped to my head where like a big event happens that people had spoiled for them or whatever. It can definitely take away from your enjoyment of the events leading up to that. Whereas the second time through, it's not as, you know, you're prepared for it. So it's not as, you're able to take in the scenery a little bit better. So I get what she's saying. You know, I get it.
Upon publication in the United States,
I don't understand being in such a maddening desire for Edward to re-enter the books. I do not understand that at all. Me, I'm like, woof. I actually just made a note last night where I was reading. I was like, God, Jacob is so much better than Edward. I'm Team Jacob all the way.
I want to talk about... Yes, I so much want to talk about that when we get to the main episode, because reading this at 16, I was like Team Edward all the way.
Oh, God, no.
And now reading it again as a grown-up, yes. I'm like, Team Jacob! Team Jacob!
It's not even close. He's just like a chill dude who likes fixing up cars and is like the opposite of toxic masculinity so far. Except for that weird, potentially problematic... gay subtext thing they got going on. We'll talk about that in the main episode. I don't even know if you know what I'm talking about, but we'll get there.
Okay, we'll get there. All right. So upon its publication in the United States, New Moon was highly successful, moved very quickly to the top of the bestseller lists, one of the most highly anticipated books of the year. It peaked at number 1 on both the New York Times bestseller list and USA Today's top 150 bestsellers, and it was the best-selling children's paperback of 2008. Over 5.3 million copies sold. Reception for New Moon was more positive than its predecessor. A lot of people criticized the middle section's pacing, but critics generally argued that the novel was more mature in tone and praised the character development and depiction of human emotion. For example, Nora Peale of teenreads.com thought that in the middle, the story sometimes drags and readers may long for the vampire's return, though she believed that New Moon will leave Meyer's many fans breathless for the sequel, as Bella finally understands everything that will be at stake if she makes the ultimate choice to give up her humanity and live like vampires forever.
Interesting. Yeah, I don't disagree. I think it's, I don't know. Yeah, pacing is my biggest issue so far. Yeah. And it being a slight rehash of, it's not a rehash, but like a very similar structure in terms of...
Yeah, it's very similar.
So far, I'm just over 200 pages in, but it's like, okay. I'm just watching their relationship for page, chapter after chapter after chapter after chapter, which I get. This is how we get the whole Team Jacob versus Team Edward thing. We did the whole Team Edward the first book. We got to do Team Jacob this book, but... Woof, it's
at least it's like infinitely less creepy than watching
it is.
The relationship.
No, it really is. That is one of the things is that it in that regard, their relationship is much less gross.
Yeah,
like it's just like, well, it's less gross. It's still cringy, but it's less gross. Yeah. All right, let's go ahead and talk about New Moon, the movie.
How much could you mean to him if he left you here, unprotected? But I can't help myself. You are so mouth-watering.
Jake, run!
New Moon is a 2009 film written again by Melissa Rosenberg, but directed this time by Chris Weitz. I don't know exactly. Weitz, probably, Weitz, who directed The Golden Compass, another infamous book adaptation.
That one was great.
I never saw it, never read it. I heard good things about the book series, but I've never seen or read. He also directed About a Boy, or believe co-directed that, and Down to Earth, which is a Chris Rock movie, and Operation Finale, and he was one of the writers on Rogue One. So, Catherine Hardwicke did not return for the sequel because the release date wouldn't allow her enough time to work on the script, in her opinion. There was conflict with the studio. They were like, we want it 1 year after, and she's like, that's not enough time. And so they're like, all right, we'll find somebody else.
She was probably right.
Probably right. I don't know. I haven't seen it yet. So, Weitz released a statement shortly after the announcement that he was going to be directing, assuring Twilight fans that he would, quote, protect on their behalf the characters, themes, and story they love. He continued by saying, this is not a task to be taken lightly, and I will put every effort into realizing a beautiful film to stand alongside a beautiful book.
That's nice.
There you go.
Well, that's a nice thing to say.
So apparently, and this is interesting, Weitz considered recasting Jacob Black due to the taller and larger version of Jacob Black we get in New Moon. Mm-hmm. That's a big part of the first thing is he's now 6'5" and, muscular, whereas he was, because he's gone through puberty over the course of the intervening
puberty will do that.
The intervening 7 months or whatever since we kind of last saw him in the book, in the previous book. But Taylor Lautner petitioned to keep the role by working out and stuff and adding like 30 pounds of muscle. And they were like, all right, you can keep the role. And I'm sure there was also no shortage of fan sort of, outrage online about recasting that role. So this is interesting. Different cameras and shooting setups were used throughout the course of this film to serve different story points. When Bella was with Edward, the camera was moved on a dolly, which is basically a big track on wheels, basically, in a very rigid straight line, apparently to reflect how their relationship was perfect, quote unquote.
I feel like that better reflects how their relationship is rigid.
Yes, I agree with that. That's what I actually thought it was going to say when I was reading this, and I was like, oh, perfect. That's the word you went with. Okay. When Bella's with Jacob, they use a Steadicam, which is if you don't know what a Steadicam is, it's a big... Well, depending on the system, it can be big or small. But generally speaking, it's like a chest harness that the camera sits on. It's like a spring-loaded arm, and it's very smooth, and it creates very fluid, organic movements. Mm-hmm. And you can go anywhere you want with it because it's the operator wherever they can walk around. The camera can go, whereas on a dolly, it can only go on the tracks, and you have to set up. It's a lot more.
I've seen you use a Steadicam before.
Yeah, I've used several different Steadicams at different times on different things I've worked on. I've used one of the ones that is like the big chest harness one with a spring-loaded arm and stuff. But nowadays, depending on what you're doing, like you can get a little gimbal, like a motorized gimbal that you hold in two hands that's tiny and accomplishes a very similar thing as a Steadicam for much less of the hassle. So, but yeah. But for the larger, because this was actually shot on film, I read too, as opposed to digital. So they probably had a much larger camera than they would potentially need otherwise. So they probably actually used like a more traditional harness Steadicam thing. But they used the Steadicam for Jacob and Bella scenes because of the fluid organic style, as I mentioned. And then when she was with schoolmates, they used a handheld shot to add like a sort of chaotic, slangy visual language to the shots.
We'll put a lot of thought into this.
Apparently. We'll see. Well, it's something to look out for as you're watching the film. To see if that helps the viewing experience at all.
If it brings a different kind of mood.
Because that is a big part in, it's something a lot of people don't think about. That is a huge component of cinematography is choosing how you're going to shoot something. Are you going to have it on a tripod? Are you going to shoot it handheld? Are you going to have movement at all? Is it going to be zooming? Is it going to be panning? All those different things, and they all imply different things. And a lot of it implies things to the audience that the audience doesn't even realize they're getting necessarily if they don't think about it too much. But shooting handheld is more frenetic. Our doorbell just rang. It's probably UPS or FedEx.
Yeah.
I'll double check.
It's the doorbell. Oh, if it's a conservative politician, say something rude.
It's the cat pine pellets.
Oh, no wonder it's heavy.
It's 50 pounds of cat pine pellets.
Elvis. Yeah. I'd be so happy.
Okay. But anyways, how you shoot something, UPS guy really got me off the rails here. off my dolly tracks, as it were. But yeah, a lot of times that the different visual styles of how the different choices for how things are shot affect completely how you view what you're watching, even if the audience doesn't necessarily pick up on the fact that the different style is affecting what they're viewing. Like I said, I think what I was getting into is like, if you shoot something handheld, it's more frenetic, and it's a lot of times it's used for scenes where there's a lot of action, or if there's a lot of people and it's supposed to, or if it's supposed to induce anxiety in a certain situation, having a handheld sort of shakier camera can add to that feeling of anxiety, of energy, that sort of thing. Whereas in certain situations, if you're trying so that can add tension, but you can also add tension sometimes in certain situations if you lock the camera down, it's on a tripod and it just holds, and then you get to really focus on the performance and what you're seeing in the shot. There's a million different ways to film things.
I feel like something we could compare it to that probably everybody will know what we're talking about is how a sitcom that's filmed with like 3 stationary cameras feels way different from a sitcom that's filmed like with mockumentary style.
Or a mockumentary style, or so a lot of sitcoms, older like stage sitcoms, are filmed with a 3-camera sitcom where they have, it's on a sound stage and there's 3 cameras set up and they're on big like zoomed in and that sort of thing, and they're all on tripods and there's not a lot of movement to them. And then some more modern but even older shows, comedies and sitcoms and stuff, are shot either handheld or with one camera, and they can do a lot more cinematic stuff, and it just feels completely different. And that is a very obvious sort of thing that doesn't necessarily dictate. It's a little bit different, but it is a similar idea. So
this is my favorite fun fact you have written down
this is
here.
wild. I assume this was said in an interview, and I assume maybe I know why it is.
I think I know why, and I want that to be why.
Okay, so according to I believe this is from IMDb trivia, but it might have been from Wikipedia. I can't remember where I got this. I think it was IMDb trivia. Apparently, New Moon is Robert Pattinson's favorite book in the Twilight series. And there's a 0% chance that the reason for that is because he's not in most of it. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, it's Robert Pattinson.
Yeah.
That's definitely why.
Absolutely. He was like, I got to show up and film one day at the beginning of the month, or the beginning of the shoot, and then I showed up at the end. It's great. It was great.
He probably read through the book and
was like, yes.
He was like that gif of Robert Downey Jr. where he's like clutching his chest.
Yeah. I still get all the residuals for being in this movie, and I don't have to be in this movie. Sign me up. I'm sure he's still one of the top billed people too. So he he's probably like number 3 on the.
Yeah.
I bet it's like Kristen Stewart, Taylor Lautner, and then him. Maybe not even. He might even still be like second. I don't know what the billing is on these movies, but I wouldn't be surprised if he was still in the top 3 or 4, even though he's not in most of it. Probably, yeah. So, editor Peter Lambert apparently, according to him, edited a portion of this film during his daily commute. And this may be the very first major motion picture in which a large majority of the first assembly edit was done in the backseat of a car, which I thought was wild. I'm going to pay attention to that editing to see if that is reflected of the fact that a guy was on a laptop in the back of a car cutting this together in like iMovie or whatever. But like,
it's just efficient.
Yeah.
He's making the best use of his time.
Well, because surely he lives in LA and he's traveling places, and it takes 3 hours to get anywhere in LA.
He's in the backseat. He probably has somebody driving him or whatever.
Oh,
right?
Yeah. I mean, even then, taking a cab or Uber. Yeah. I think Uber was around in 2009, but yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, no, he wasn't driving. He was in the back seat. But my point being that, regardless, you don't have necessarily the most powerful editing setup in a situation like that, and he also wouldn't have access. It's just a strange thing to me as somebody who knows how editing works a little bit. You can definitely edit on like a laptop and stuff, but you would have to have the video. It's an assembly edit, so it doesn't. It's different. Like, it's still weird to me. It's just a little strange. Although maybe he's remoting in. I guess that's possible. He could be remoting into a computer. I don't know.
Yeah.
However he's doing it, it's interesting. It was an interesting fun thing.
Up until you said that he was in the backseat of a car, I was really pleased with the mental image of him like on a bus somewhere or like in the subway, just like clickety clack editing the second Twilight movie.
Yeah. Somebody's just sitting next to him, like glances over, like, that looks terrible. These fucking film students and their projects. So the film was released on November 20th, 2009 in most countries, and it set domestic box offices in America as the biggest midnight screening, grossing $26.3 million in its first night. But that was surpassed by its sequel, Eclipse. And then later on, it eventually, or over the course of its first one day, not just the opening night, it broke the record for the biggest one-day gross in the U.S. with $72 million, beating The Dark Knight. They're very popular movies.
Yeah. I mean, we talked about it. This was a whole thing.
Yep. The film,
the whole last thing.
The critical reception, I don't have any written reviews, but I do have some scores. The film holds a score of 28% fresh on Rotten Tomatoes, 44% whatever positive on Metacritic, and has a 4.7 out of 10 on IMDb from user reviews. Just for comparison's sake, and I think I'm going to do this with all the movies from here on out so we can get a feel for how everybody felt about all the films. Twilight, the first movie, had 49% fresh on Rotten Tomatoes, so it dropped from 49% to 28% fresh. Had a 56% approval rating on Metacritic, so it dropped 12% for the sequel. And then had a 5.2 out of 10 on IMDb, so it dropped 0.5%. Now, the IMDb one I only include just because these were always going to never have a realistic IMDb score. IMDb scores are kind of meaningless, like the user scores kind of meaningless. To be fair, the critic aggregators are also, you take them in their context of what they are, because this is the kind of thing that IMDb scores tend to reflect poorly upon. As we discussed, this is sort of the shitty internet meme culture of the mid 2000s, where and current day still, but where things like this get dumped on just because like angry nerds on the internet want to hate it for no reason. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like it just like 1 star, Twilight gay, like stuff like that. I mean, we're watching right now. We're watching a series on Netflix that just came out called Cursed, and it's got like a 5 out of 10 on IMDb. And I was like, we were watching. I was like, it's fine. Like it's pretty good so far. Like we were only a few episodes in, and then I went and I was scrolling through the reviews on IMDb. It's like all angry people like SJW is ruining. It's like, okay, great, cool. So yeah, it's one of those things where the scores on IMDb don't take them with a grain of salt. But those are probably fairly accurate. To be fair, I'm not saying that the 5 out of 10 is necessarily wrong. I'm just saying that sometimes you got to take those with a grain of salt. Katie, where do we watch this?
Well, you can check with your local library. Always encourage you to try and do that first.
Yeah.
If you don't already own a copy of this fine film. The entire series also airs fairly frequently on Freeform, which I believe used to be ABC Family.
I think it was ABC Family, which used to be Fox Family or whatever, or not. One of the. It's been like 3. That channel has changed names like 8 times.
Yeah, but we have YouTube TV, and we recorded the entire series.
Yeah,
we have it like on our DVR or whatever.
DVR,
virtual
cloud
DVR.
Yeah.
So you might be able to find it there if you have access to that channel.
If you
search for it, it's probably
if you have any sort of cable or satellite or anything like that.
You can also rent through Amazon Prime.
That's what we did for the first one, because the first one we couldn't record. And it's like $4.
You can rent through YouTube Movies, which I think is around the same price as Amazon Prime. Yeah. And if your Hulu account, if you upgraded that to Hulu Live, you can watch it through Hulu Live, but not with a normal Hulu account.
You can also go to, if you still have a local video store.
Yeah.
Which we actually do, but...
We do.
We just never.
We have a family video here.
I would have to create a new account.
Yes, you would.
I believe I owe quite a few dollars
yes, you kept those movies in your car for like months.
I forgot they were there for a long time.
I mean, in your defense, they were in the glove box, which you never opened.
Yeah, I don't ever need to. Yep. Anyways, so those are all the places you can watch the Twilight Saga New Moon. We hope you do, and that you come back in 1 week's time as we assuredly spend 3 hours breaking down New Moon, as we didn't intend to with the first one, but it ended up being a 3-hour episode somehow. Even though we're like, surely we won't have as much to talk about as we did with like Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings, but apparently we did. So, in 1 week's time, that is what we're doing. And until that time, guys, gals, non-binary, everybody else.
Keep reading books.
Keep watching movies.
And keep being awesome.